Hello and welcome to ThePrint. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor, and now it's conventionally accepted that India's ancient civilizations, the empires that we had, were economic powerhouses. How did they achieve this? What was the way of thought that they followed that brought about this economic might? And how can it apply to the current day? Because India has, of course, changed a lot since then. That's what we're going to discuss today. And to do that, going to be in conversation with Mr. Sriram Balasubramanian. He's an economist and an author. He's already written a book called Dharmanomics, and soon to be released is another book called Dharmanomics, which looks into the indigenous and sustainable economic models that were applied during some of our ancient civilizations and an exploration of how it might be applied in the present time. Thank you so much, Mr. Subramaniam, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. My pleasure.
So now, Mr. Subramaniam, first of all, I've read the book and it's very, very deeply researched. And now it covers broadly the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, and the Vijayanagar empires. And it looks at how Dharma is a concept there. As you've mentioned, Dharma has been explored by other historians on a societal level. But how it applies to the economy hasn't really been explored, and this is what you have attempted to do. But before we start, could you explain to us the concept of dharma as you apply it, or the way you look at it in your book, and how it applies to economics?
So to give you a context, before I answer your question, let me give you some perspective of what my research is. So over a period of, say, now almost a decade, I've been sort of working on the Dharma-based economic frameworks that we talk about, starting from Kautilya's Arthashastra in 3rd century BCE. So Kautilyanomics tries to sort of create a framework, an economic framework, based on the Arthashastra. Right. Because like I mentioned, much of the discussion on the Arthashastra has been the political sort of angle of Chanakya. Right? While all of that is true, the text per se is something on wealth creation or on economics, right?
It's called Arthashastra.
Exactly, for that particular reason. But unfortunately, there's been very little, sort of discussion or even debate on this subject. Except for Balbir Sihag's book on Kautilya's Arthashastra, very little has come through in terms of I forget academic material, but even sort of normal consumer nonfiction. Right. So this book tries to create a framework called Dharmic capitalism based on the idea of Dharma as envisaged by Kautilya. So the definitions of Dharma, for the sake of, of course, Dharma is a very multi-dimensional word. Exactly. It's very difficult to translate. Right. So there are, many meanings for it. But purely for the sake of economic policy and policy discussions, I define it based on three sort of parameters. One is ethics. 2 is responsibilities, 3 is harmony, a societal harmony and things like that. Right. So through the prism of ethics, I talk about the role of institutions, clean institutions, clean administration, clean leadership as qualities which encompass ethics, and also ethical sort of business functioning. And then through the prism of harmony, I also talk about sort of a global outlook. Not just social harmony, but also engaging with the rest of the world, wealth creation through that prism. And lastly, through the prism of responsibilities. Again, this is a sort of a unique feature in the sense that Kautilya argues for the role of societal, familial, and public responsibilities as well for individuals. Right. And all of this sort of maps into 3 major outcomes. One is the role of a state which is strong, rule enforcing, but doesn't micromanage activities. Okay. 2, wealth creation via engaging with the rest of the world in terms of trade, commerce, and things like that. And 3rd is sustainable growth and welfare. Sustainability through the prism of these responsibilities which I mentioned earlier, and also welfareism, in terms of addressing the needs of the common people. Right? So this is the broad idea of Kautilyanomics. And then it deals with, each chapter sort of goes into, say, trade, inequality, labor contracts, and then gives Kautilya's ideas, which are applicable in today's times to that, right? So we dealt with 3rd century BC, and there's also a chapter which talks about how Kautilya himself agrees that, or mentions that a lot of his ideas were there already in a prior age. even in the Mahabharata, in Ramayana, in the Vedas and things like that. And he mentions about Brihaspati, Shukracharya and others as contributors to a lot of these ideas, right? So there is a much, wider sort of ambit as well, which I don't really cover, but as an introductory chapter on that. So as a continuation of this, I also look at common era kingdoms. So that's where the new book, Dharmanomics, comes into play. And with the same sort of definitional element of Dharma, which I mentioned in Kautilya, I sort of extend that here. And in this, what I notice in my research is that over these common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagar Empire, and also Kambojidis. I deal with Cambodia, Vietnam, which I call Champa, and all these Southeast Asian kingdoms, right? You see a continuity of the presence of Dharma in all these kingdoms. Not just as a spiritual and sort of a religious sort of background, but more as a societal sort of an economic policy narrative as well, where it plays an important role. So in this, I sort of create or share three key pillars, I would say. One is what we discussed, Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, which has its presence in some of these places. Second is what I define as the Dharmic ecosystem, which is essentially, the role of temples and the temple-based economies.
I was going to come to that, yes.
In all these, kingdoms. And lastly, on Srini Dharma, the role of Srinis, which is basically corporate guilds, who played a very important role in building commerce and economic activity during ancient times. So this is broadly the sort of summary of...
Right, okay. So there are several pillars here that I did want to touch upon. Let's start with the Srinis. As you call them, the corporate guilds. What was the kind of role that they had in bringing dharmic influences to the economy then? And what would their parallels be over here? Because we have a lot of big corporate houses here as well. So, if you could talk a little more about that.
Right. So the first thing is that, right, I mean, these corporate guilds, whom we call Srinis, have a very long history. I mean, they even go, in some cases, much before Kautilya. Because Kautilya's Arthashastra itself talks a lot about this. They were basically modern day sort of multinational corporations.
Right.
So they are entities which were sort of, the central, you could view them in today's parlance in two terms, right? One is the multinational corporations, or something like a CII or FCCI, right?
Or a federation of bodies.
A federation of bodies. It's a combination of both, put it that way, right? So basically what they did is they facilitated commerce, trade among countries, and they ensured that their sort of members of part of this entity, could sort of bargain in for labor contracts or trade contracts or whatever it is, with other entities in a much more consolidated manner. And more importantly, they also enabled a lot of this trade to happen, right? Eventually you want, moving from one place to another. They had, for example, many offices, or I can call it an office, but in different parts of the world. For example, in Indonesia, in Malaysia and Cambodia and even in Champa and Vietnam, there were these trade guilds which had setups, which had offices and things like that, representatives in these places. Because you need to note one thing, right, is that Bharat was central to the entire maritime trade prism, right? We are talking about trade from Middle East coming all the way to rest of Asia and to China, right? And because of its sort of geographical, proximity to all this, they served as sort of transient trade hubs for a lot of these trade.
And the time period we're talking about is about 300 AD to about 800, 900.
Correct. I mean, we are talking about early CE, Common Era, but much of the talk is around, say, 8th, 9th century CE till about 13th, 14th century CE. Okay. So that's where I would say the peak of this was there, because that's when the Cholas were at their peak. Right. You had, even in Cambodia and Vietnam, you had, much stronger kingdoms. So they had their presence much earlier as well, but the peak was during this phase. Okay. So what they used to do, for example, the Cholas had a very, I would say, overarching influence on even politics. Not just socio-economic elements, but also in politics.
The Srinis had the influence.
Yeah. For example, they were financing a lot of these, financing some of the Cholas, so much so to the point that when Rajendra Chola, that is the son of Rajaraja Chola. Rajaraja Chola built the Brihadishwara temple. Yes. His son Rajendra Chola, he was well known for conquering Southeast Asia or going across Southeast Asia and winning battles, and also going across North India. So that's why it's called Gangai Konda Cholapuram, which is basically he went to Ganga and then conquered it, went near Ganga and then came back. So that, and then he built his own city called Gangai Konda Cholapuram, which is still there, where you have a replica of the Brihadishwara temple there. So one of the reasons why he went and did battle in Southeast Asia was because there's a reason why they conquered Southeast Asia but did not rule, and the reason is because of this. Because a lot of these guilds were doing a lot of their business networks in these routes, right? So the Srivijaya kingdom, which is in Sumatra, which is today's Indonesia, they had a sort of a tiff with one of the major guilds called Ainurvar. Ainurvar is in Tamil, it's you can loosely translate it to 500. But they were one of the sort of biggest guilds that Srinis that you could see. So they had some issues with them. And then on top of it, the Cambodian king at that time also had some issues with the Srivijaya Empire. So the Cholas were in alliance with the Cambodian rulers, and more importantly, they wanted their business corporations to flourish, to continue. So because of this, one of the reasons that is attributed is for the conquest is because of the guild itself, the lack of access of these business routes for these guilds to have trade with China and others. So what I'm trying to say is there is the Srinis and the guilds played not just an important sort of commercial role in enabling, expanding commercial trade with the rest of the world, and then sort of expanding the products that we had for the rest of the world. They also played an important socio sort of political role in financing a lot of these kingdoms. And that was just not a pan-Indian phenomena. It was, it was much more regional, than we can give credit for. So what I'm trying to say, and lastly, on these guilds were also, governed. They had their own sort of architecture of governance, which was quite democratic in terms of choosing the head of the guild, and they had a sort of a constitution by themselves. And all of these quite a few of these guilds were based on the idea of Dharma. In fact, the Ainurvar, the 500 guild, was based on a principle called Binanjaya Dharma, which is a philosophy that they espouse to. So various concepts of Dharma, among its many definitions, played an important role in the governance structure of all these guilds, which was the base for their sustainability for such a long time.
But this is very, very interesting in the current context, because now governments over time, it's not just the current government, but previous governments as well, they've used large corporate houses to go and further India's interests abroad. This government's also been doing it, but it's been receiving a lot of political pushback and backlash about it, and there are a lot of allegations being made, of course. But you feel that it's a natural extension of that dharmic philosophy of using business industry bodies, I would say, to further India's interests?
I think, look, a one-to-one comparison with today's times is, of course, a bit, it has its own sort of comparative issues. But if you look at the underlying principle, right, even today, if you take, say, the top 10, 15 corporates in this country, right, most of them are family-driven corporates, right? And most of them, whether they are publicly listed or not, these large family conglomerates, their decision-making, their sort of, how they make corporate decisions is through a variety of processes, but a large part of it is also their cultural fabric that determines their decisions, right? This is the reality, right? Academics and elites might not, be too sort of attuned to this, but the reality of people who are doing business, even today, is that a lot of these cultural sort of narratives, norms and narratives, play an important role in decision making, right? So, in that sense, when you really look about it, I mean, most of these entities also had such sort of norms and narratives that are involved in decision making. But the national interest, put it that way, was something I think even in those times they were probably cognizant about. Not just the commercial part of it, the fact that, they could have these, kingdoms expand their origins and, move to other places and institutionalize or transfer some of their knowledge was also probably part of their thinking as well, thinking it's more of a national cause. But I wouldn't say that in those times, the Cholas, for example, used them to sort of always, enhance their agenda, right? It could be the other way around also, in the sense that for them to gain sort of credence and, credibility within the governmental structure, they could have probably also financed some of these, Cholas. But there's one important point that I want to note here. The role of the state was very minimal in these guilds, right? Often we are sort of, mentally attuned to think that if it's a monarchy, right, that everything is hyper controlled, right? And that's not really the case. You find a lot of situations where the guilds had their own independence. They didn't, the state provided the regulatory sort of, framework, but, they had their own sort of a very little minimum interference of the state in their day-to-day functioning. That's what I see. And then also that they were highly egalitarian, right? You had people across communities, across, caste and gender who were part of all these guilds. So in that sense, they were a sort of a cross-sectional representation of the sort of the indigenous business community which was there over a period of time. And there were many such guilds, right? This was, the Ainurvar is one of the biggest guilds. For example, there's another guild called Nanadesi, which had its presence in Vietnam, for example, in Champa. So all of these entities had their own sort of, niche areas of expertise and things like that. And they were, not necessarily always subservient to the state.
Right. And now you mentioned about the kind of light touch governance that even these monarchies followed. I was going to touch upon that, bringing it to the current period, because far from being a monarchy, now we are a federal democracy where you have elected governments, not just at the center, but each state has an elected government. And a lot of economic decisions are made at the central level, municipal level, and of course at the central level. So, and at the state level. So, I mean, how does that thinking from our ancient civilizations, how can it apply here?
Right. So there are a couple of things that, that can be relevant, right? So the first thing is, the so-called decentralized model of economic governance, right? That is something that you see a lot in ancient Bharats, from the evidences that we see, because much of the institutions, especially in the common eras, they were all, centered around the village and the economies around the village, right? So the so-called Dharmic ecosystem, which is the temples, played a very important role in not just, if you move away from the religiosity element of it and look at it purely as a commercial entity and their sort of, role in expanding commerce, you see that they played a very important role, because in most of these villages there used to be one or two huge temples like what we see today, and then there are a plethora of small temples, and the temples themselves had, provide some revenue to the state, right, in terms of financing and things like that. But more than that, the ecosystem that the temples generate, right, meaning the shops around it, the tourism that comes with it, the expansion of, networks because you want to move from one place to another, and all these things ensured that there's a sort of a decentralized structure where each of these villages had, some of these economic drivers because of this ecosystem, and that ensured that there's a far more, not sort of an urban-centric approach, but far more sort of a decentralized approach. And that's how, even if you look at the governance of the Cholas, they had the Patinams, which were, the Nagarams, the Patinams, and the village assemblies, and all these things sort of ensured that there were connectivity from, say, the decentralized village ecosystem to the port cities, so that there's trade.
So that commerce can happen.
And all these things happen. And this was encompassing the communities, right? The community played a very important role in enabling all this. And that's why I'm bringing this point is the role of monarchs again is that, these are things that cannot be done in a highly controlled environment. so I think they were, at least in the Cholas, they were shrewd enough to understand that at some level people wanted to be, liberated to do what they want to do, but as long as you provide an overarching structure to it.
Right. So, but even now, the temple state dynamics is again in the news, where there's a rising call for the temples to be self-governing and not be in government control. And the temples themselves, they've kind of diminished in terms of their economic influence. There's of course a lot of the religious influence, but their economic influence from the times that you're talking about has clearly diminished. So do you feel that there is some argument to be made about the temples being strengthened on their own as independent units of economic strength?
See, we need to, we had liberalization in the 1990s, right? Early 1990s. So large sections of the state and its apparatus was all liberalized for a variety of reasons, right? If you start looking at the temple-based economies as sort of an economic entity, then I think it's a no-brainer, in the sense that you obviously, if a lot of the other elements of the economy have benefited from privatization moving away from the state, naturally, if you look at this as an economic entity, then there is a definite case for it to be moved away from the state, right? But of course, there's the political angle to it and the issues surrounding it, right? While this is something that, one would really help it to sort of liberate the economic potential of it, I think a more important conversation is the ecosystem that it generates around it, right? That is where the crux of the economic value is, in my view, right? So, for example, if you take the United States, for example, right? You have all these university towns in most of the places, yes. Whether it is Cornell in Ithaca or Urbana-Champaign in Champaign, or most of the top universities, right? They're all in university towns. What is the model of a university town, right? You basically have an educational institution which is central to that university. It is the hub of that village or that town, right. And it provides commerce for that town. And it provides obviously education, world-class education to a lot of people, and it creates a brand by itself, and then that's how the model is, right? If you, let's say you replicate something like this into a temple-based economic model, since we already have these temples, right? Thousands of them, yes. Right? And thousands of them have many people who come and visit and who come and, have darshan, and, it's sort of an autopilot, right? That keeps going on. So if you're able to sort of create such a model where this serves as a hub, much similar to these towns, where it can be used as a sort of an economic catalyst for the ecosystem around it, right? And if you liberalize that ecosystem around it, then it can make things, you can expand using the apparatus that's already there for economic potential. So that is one area which in the current context, that given our limitations, which is one area which can be expanded, in my view.
Right. And this was the thinking behind even the Ayodhya temple. Apart from the religious significance of it, the selling point of it also was that it would do a lot for the economy of Ayodhya as a city. But as you said, we already have a lot of these temples in place, and clearly they're having some sort of economic influence on their areas. What can we do to kind of enhance that? How do you help that?
Yeah, I think there has to be a more structured approach, right? In the sense that, we have to, in my view, we have to see it as an economic opportunity and have a coordinated sort of approach. First of all, see, the problem with all this is data, right? The lack of data is a big issue, because, you have data, for example, of the revenue a particular temples generate, right? From, say, in Tamil Nadu, for example, HRNC and a few other government entities which are doing. But most of the data is not, transparent enough, it's not open enough, and it gives you only one part of the picture. That is the revenue that the temple makes, right? You also need to do, so one of the areas of research that needs to expand a lot is on the ecosystem around the temples, right? Absolutely. How much do they, some of the questions that you answer, right? That you're seeking, right? How much of it, contributes to the local economy? What is its, say, for example, time series? What is the, extent to which it has an impact on economic activity in that area or that region, for example, right? most of our talk is anecdotal evidence, right?
That so many shops came up, you can see them and all of that, but there's no data.
Correct. One of the attempts in some of this work is to sort of trigger people to go and analyze this and have data systems which can give us a bit more information on some of these things. Because more and more, once we have information on the economic potential of this, then it's a different ballgame altogether. Because we are seeing tangible, inputs, outputs, based on which you can sort of evolve policy or make policy prescriptions. So I think that is one huge area which can attempt to answer some of these questions, right? Second is, one is the temple-based ecosystem which we're talking about. Another is this entire sort of way of life narrative, right? And its influence on economic policy and decision making, which we talk about, say, like we mentioned a bit earlier, in the West, many researchers have talked about the role of culture and identities on economic decision making.
Absolutely.
Right. So if you look at Gary Becker, for some of his Nobel Prize winner in economics, some of his earlier work was on some of issues related to discrimination and things like that based on some of this. Even George Akerlof, though his Nobel Prize in 2001 was on asymmetric information, his work on identity economics, the role of norms and narratives. Abner Grief is another person at Stanford who's done work on all this. What I'm trying to say is a lot of researchers in the West have made attempts to understand the role of norms and narratives in decision making, right? And in very simplistic terms, we talk about this, the way of life, how our natural way of life makes us making economic. So I'll give you an example, right? So if you take discretionary expenditure, right? Discretionary essentially, non-essential expenditure, right? If you look at the graph of when these discretionary expenditure really shoots up, much of the discretionary expenditure happens on times during where, say, cultural events like Diwali or other forms of cultural related events happen, right? That's when the discretionary, for example, UPI transactions, the latest numbers during Diwali really shot up compared to times during the
non-festival months.
Yeah. In Bharat's case, it's even more important because we have festivals around the year, right? So a lot of, whether it's a stock market, I mean, for example, Mukesh Ambani, when he's speaking to Jensen Huang, in a recent discussion, he speaks about Diwali and why it is the beginning of the new year and things like that, right? So whether it is the Ambanis or a small kirana shop, much of their sort of discretionary expenditure is influenced by these choices that they make, right? So the question really is, how do you sort of try to understand this a bit more, right? So I think that's where more research needs to go, because besides the ecosystem we're talking about, the connections between the cultural fabric and to economic decision making is very important, because I mean it really helps us to sort of understand how people make choices, and also provides us a platform for to enable policy to be aligned to the way of life rather than the other way around, right? It's not like, for example, if policymakers sit in, say, Delhi and prescribe a policy which is completely anathemical to our way of life, then in all likelihood that policy's effectiveness will be much lesser.
People just won't follow it.
Exactly, or they won't, take the effort to come to terms with the policy. Right?
Rather, it's the letter of the law versus the spirit.
Correct.
People will follow the letter, but not really in spirit.
Correct. So imagine if it's the other way around, right? You have a policy which is aligned to, which looks at the way of life, tries to understand it, explores some of the nuances of it, and then implements policy in a way which is aligned to this. Then it makes policy making far more effective.
Right.
So, for example, if you take even Swachh Bharat, right? I mentioned this in my previous book on Swachh Bharat, where you find that Swachh Bharat is far more effective in rural areas compared to some of the urban areas. One of the things that I've noticed is that this ability of Saucham, which is a definition of Dharma, for example, on being clean and cleanliness. I mean, most of us are clean within our houses, right? It's just that when you come to the society outside, it's become problematic, right?
So civic sensibility, basically.
Correct, civic sensibility in that sense. The PM scheme and the massive campaign behind it, so triggered a sort of a reaction from people, especially in rural areas, where it sort of, triggered this consciousness which they had, you can call it dharmic consciousness or whatever it is, and brought it to the neighborhood. So much so that in quite a bit of rural areas, I find this almost as an autopilot now. Initially they set up all these Swachhata clinics and all these things,
right.
but nowadays, you find that it's become a sort of they're embracing it. So this is one example, for example, where the policy is sort of aligned to this way of life and then expands on that, and it makes it far more effective in terms of outcomes. So this is sort of another, narrative or another, area where, it could be valuable for policymakers to sort of try to understand this a bit more.
Basically, society's beliefs and their practices over time and how to apply policy to those rather than trying to mold those to policy.
Yeah, and also use some of these avenues for policy experimentation. So, for example, we are having the Mahakumbh, which is happening in March this year, next year, right? So this is going to be the gathering of probably the largest amount of people
in the world.
Yeah. Right? But it's a huge opportunity for one to execute policy, because if you have, say, a policy narrative, something like Swachhata or some scheme, which you want to really sort of bring about and expand to a large section of people in one setting, this is a brilliant setting to do it, right?
Correct.
So that's a sort of approach which can be useful for policymakers who can try to get greater understanding of these ideas and then implement it so that their policy making is far more effective, rather than they just putting something which is conceptualized in the West, and only a few elites know about it, but for the common people there is no sort of resonance.
I understand. So we have actually now discussed a lot of topics, a lot of issues, a lot of ideas from the past. But in a nutshell, how would you say that the concept of Dharma can be applied to our modern polity, society, economy?
Yeah, in a nutshell, what I would say is, the entire idea of Dharma-based economic frameworks, I think what I try to establish is a couple of things. One, a sort of a qualitative time series, which showcases that over a period of these thousands of years, over these kingdoms, that there has been a philosophy based on Dharma, economics, a social economic philosophy based on Dharma, right, which has played an important role in these kingdoms and their sort of prosperity during this time, right? So we established this qualitative time series, right? And an extension of this argument is that this is based on the way of life and cultural norms that we're talking about, and those norms still continue today in a lot of our day-to-day activities, right? So the extent to which this, these norms and how they influence decision making for economic choices is an important area of study that one needs to do more, right? One of the areas where this can really benefit, I feel, is where you take particular policy issues, where there is a lot of confluence on some, on the role of narratives and norms that I mentioned, and try to understand them more and then make nudges. For example, in my previous book, I mentioned about these dharmic nudges.
Right.
Where,
yes, you had.
You these are nudges that you can bring about in policy so that you can make it far more effective. So I would say that, these ideas can be applied, in a couple of ways, one of which is an addendum to the existing framework. But wherever there's a tweak that is required, which can enable effective policy implementation, these ideas could be brought in. And two, it could also give you a better understanding of how people make consumer choices, especially discretionary choices, and how you can trigger some of these choices and consumer spending using some of these research areas that are coming out. So broadly speaking, in a nutshell, I would say that these are areas where there are future prospects. In fact, the third book which I'm working on now deals with how some of these frameworks can be used in for Bharat to be Viksit Bharat. So that's the third part of the book.
And I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I've read Kautilyanomics, now I've read Dharmanomics. Third one, I don't know what the title will be, but I'm looking forward to it. But on that note, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sharad. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.